Good morning. Welcome on this beautiful Saturday morning. My name is Samantha Robertson, and I am the graduate chair of the Forced Migration Human Trafficking Initiative at the Pardee School. I'm also a master's student at the Pardee School, getting my master's in global development policy. I will be the moderator for this panel on public opinion and the media. And we all know the importance of public opinion, and especially the media today in today's society, with how fast information can spread via Twitter, Facebook, and all of those different types of websites. And we also know that human trafficking is still a topic that still holds a high social stigma and is not widely discussed in the media. So in the era of fake news and how fast information is disseminated and getting out the correct information, I'm really excited to hear what this panel has to say. We have a wide variety of people, from academics to policymakers to students. So with that in mind, I will open up our panel.
All right. Okay. So thank you all for coming out fairly early on a Saturday morning. I want to present some results today from a project I'm engaged in with undergraduate students at the College of William and Mary, where we're studying how the issue of human trafficking is framed in the media and understood by the public, both as an issue by itself and in relation to related issues such as refugees and other migration flows. So in other words, how can we characterize the human trafficking migration nexus as it exists in the public mind, right? And can we expect, in fact, the public to have a fairly clear understanding about what these different concepts refer to? So in my presentation, I want to make 3 points. One, that as I will show you, the discussion and framing of trafficking in the media actually overlaps to a considerable extent, and I would argue to a problematic extent, with the discussion of refugees and migration more broadly. 2, this is more the case today than it was in the past, and it is more the case in Europe, where there's migration is a larger issue in many ways than it is in the United States. And 3, within individual countries in Europe, I'll look at the United Kingdom, it is true more for conservative and tabloid papers than it is for other papers. So I want to begin by showing a recent quotation by a public official involved in this issue area that illustrates part of the problem. So in June of 2017, a video appeared on Facebook showing the abuse of migrants and refugees by a smuggling gang in Libya. And this is the comment in response by the UNHCR director for the area. So notice first that these sort of 3 categories of people flows appear together in a single sentence. So there's trafficking, there's refugees, there's migrants. And notice too that trafficking is actually not quite the correct term here. These are human smugglers. These aren't necessarily trafficking. Right? And that's actually the UNHCR person whom you would hope would be a little less fuzzy in his terminology. And so in the rest of my presentation, what I want to show is that this is not just a cherry-picked anecdote. That's in fact what much of the coverage is like. So we have collected all the articles published in 9 leading newspapers in the UK and the United States over the past quarter century that mention migrants, refugees, or human trafficking. This table just shows you the number of articles, as well as towards the right there, the number of articles that mention at the same time trafficking and migration, or all 3 of these categories. As you can see, it's a pretty large data set. In fact, we have collected more articles about trafficking than any previous study on the issue has, more than 7,000 in total. But as you can also see, that number is dwarfed by the number of articles on refugees and migration, so you can already get a sense that it might be hard for the public to form a clear picture of how trafficking is different. Also, as you can see in this column, which shows basically the proportion of articles that mention trafficking that also mention migration more broadly, even in the articles themselves, these topics are often treated at the same time. So the data I'm going to show you now identify the words and phrases that appear disproportionately often in the immediate context of these terms related to migration, trafficking, and refugees. The general term for that is collocation analysis. I'm happy to discuss the method in more detail if anyone has questions, but now I want to just go ahead and talk about the results. For the sake of clarity, I'm only going to focus on one US paper, the Washington Post, and then 3 British papers, The Guardian, which is the leading sort of left of center broadsheet, The Times, slightly right-leaning, traditionally the paper of record, and then The Mail, which is one of the largest right-wing tabloids. All right, so this table gives us for trafficking in the immediate context which words and phrases are strongly associated with those references. Highlighted in blue are proper names and organizations, right? And most of them will sort of make sense to you. Highlighted in red are terms that stand out for that particular paper. So notice that only the Washington Post and the Guardian mention labor issues, right? The other two, pretty much the key terms are all associated with sex trafficking. And notice also that the Mail, the tabloid, has a much stronger framing in terms of criminal aspects of this, right? So next I want to look at words and phrases that are strongly associated with all 3 of these categories, so where we see the overlap in the framing. And here I've added 2 more colors, green, to show you that, again, only these 2 on the left here, the Washington Post and the Guardian, talk about it prominently in terms of rights, and purple, you can see the criminality, illegality sort of framing, and you can see that it becomes more salient. This is in declining order of salience. It becomes more salient as you move from left to right. So finally, I want to quickly look at patterns over time. I'm going to skip over the patterns for just trafficking and go straight to covering all 3 of them. I know. And so here, I just want to say, you can't really see it in the table, but it is in fact true that the number of words and phrases that are strongly associated across all 3 of those categories with the reporting, the number of such phrases grows over time. It grows over time for each paper, and it is in fact larger in the United Kingdom than it is in the United States. And in addition, I think it's worth seeing here in the sort of most modern period, right, that in the Washington Post and the Guardian, you see sort of a shift to sort of focusing on the people at risk. There's a little bit of that in the Times. And on the far right, in the Daily Mail, you can continue to see this emphasis on criminality. So just to restate my main claims, the overlap in framing of trafficking, refugees, and migration is quite strong. It's probably hard for the average public person, consumer of news, to form key conceptual clarity across the categories. The overlap varies across newspapers and over time. It's stronger today than it was in the past. It's stronger in the UK than in the US. And within the United Kingdom, it's strongest in right-wing papers and tabloids. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next we have Yujin.
Good morning, my name is Yujin. I'm a master's student. Okay. I'm a master's student at Yang's-Po studying international security. And first, I'm really honored to be here as a panel and as a student. So today, I'm here to share my small research proposal about the role of collaborative journalism in disrupting human trafficking networks. So I want to start my presentation by introducing collaborative journalism cases. The Panama Papers project. It was led by International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in 2016. About 400 journalists from 80 countries worked together to track the global tax haven. But how could they possibly work, even though they were sitting in different countries and the scale of this project was so huge? Basically, the open source tools were used to create a cloud platform and connect the journalists. Especially the visualization tools called Neo4j and Linkurious were used to visualize the connections between the offshore companies, middlemen, and the beneficiaries. And another example can be Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, and it is led by 40 regional major news media around the world, and they basically investigate into the organized crime and corruptions through a cross-border investigation. In this case as well, they developed a visual investigative scenarios, which is a data visualization platform that designed it for mapping complex crime or business networks. So these cases clearly show how collaborative journalism using cloud platform can uncover global criminal networks. So which means collaborative journalism can play an important role in disrupting human trafficking networks as well. So to facilitate their collaboration, I would like to suggest a cloud platform in the form of interactive map. So let's say Thai journalists interviewed the Cambodian victims of trafficking in Thailand seafood processing factories. Then they, based on their testimonies, journalists saved their trafficking journey and trafficking route as a dots on the collab in this interactive map, indicating in which city they were approached by the informal recruiters and through which route they crossed the border to Thailand and in which factory they were exploited, but without revealing any personal information. I suggest this tool because this tool is not for compiling victims' database, but more for visualizing and identifying the patterns and trends of human trafficking networks in each region. So once enough data are collected on this cloud platform to show a certain pattern, then local journalists can start their investigation and put the whole picture of human trafficking networks together. But there are three reasons why I think this cloud platform is important and critical for the success of collaborative journalism. Firstly, greater impact. Once journalists collaborate, it can bring all the participating media's audience as its potential audience, so they can create a greater ripple effect at regional and global level, which could not have been foreseen by individual media outlets. And secondly, efficiency. The information that doesn't seem very valuable in one geographic location can be crucially important in another. So this means the journalist can find the hidden relations of each criminal node, and they can connect the dots in different geographic locations, just like putting pieces of puzzle together. So then we can leverage local journalists' experience and resources who have the best knowledge in their localities. And thirdly, sustainability. Actually, while researching on this topic, I found that there are some collaborative journalism cases that investigate into human trafficking, but most of their efforts were limited to certain geographic scope or specific cases. So once this centralized cloud platform is put in place, let's say by Global Investigative Journalism Network, or ICIJ, then it can gain greater momentum with the continuous inputs from the journalists all over the world. Then eventually this collaboration and cooperation can be repeated and can remain sustainable. So this is my brief overview of my research, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Yujin. Philip, we have you up next.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to present right here. Is that okay?
That is completely
All right,
fine.
great. I can play sound easier from here. My name is Phillip Martin. I'm a senior investigative journalist at WGBH here in Boston. My work is done for both WGBH Local and for PRI's The World. And over the last few years, I've been focused on human trafficking in various ways, starting in 2010, looking at New England specifically, looking at cases where venues have been used to facilitate human trafficking, and looking at how those venues have been utilized and why. Looking, for example, at the rather small scale, but still important use of nail salons and the larger scale use of massage parlors in this area, in the New England area, to facilitate human trafficking. I also looked at what we call the underground trade, looking at routes from Southeast Asia, specifically Fujian province in Thailand to New York, and from New York to Massachusetts and other parts of the East Coast. And then worked on a series looking at jobs, the role of individuals, men largely, in mainly 99%, in basically establishing the supply side of human trafficking, and why that is extraordinarily important to disrupt that supply side. Today, I'm going to look at some stories that I think are talked about, but others that are undertold, and others that aren't told at all. In recent years, investigative journalists, as has been pointed out, have become adept at sifting through intricate layers of the underground trade known as human trafficking and saving lives in the process. One example is the Associated Press' excellent series of reporting exposing the enslavement of Rohingya people in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia. That expose was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Less adept, I'm afraid, have been our reporting on sex trafficking. It tends to be sensationalist. I too have been guilty of that. What has to happen, of course, when that happens is to work hard to avoid sensationalism. Try to basically focus on the facts, as they say, just the facts, ma'am, and try to avoid the more, if you will, salacious aspects, as some call it, of this, of coverage, as we've seen with types of coverage. I won't mention the network, but for a while you saw something called the sex slaves of suburbia. This was the type of coverage that we had seen for a long time in looking at human trafficking, and it failed to look at any number of things involving human trafficking, including the racialization of human trafficking. Many victims, survivors in this country but because of any number of social conditions, Latina, African American, poor white individuals. They happen to be Asian in the context of migration primarily, but also increasingly young women from Central America. Some of the undercovered stories that I would like to focus on and I'm involved in basically developing series on at this moment is an elaboration on New York to East Coast trafficking, arriving again from Asia, Fujian province in Thailand. I'm looking also at foster care. There's a huge connect between young people who are in foster care and when they turn 18 years old and the transitions that occur. A disproportionate number of young people have been trafficked who have also been in foster care. I call it the foster care to Backpage.com pipeline because that's what we're seeing right now. Backpage playing a major role in basically advertising these young people. Another undercovered issue is the trafficking of boys, greatly undercovered in the United States, largely because, and I put again the onus on media in many ways, because it does not attract the same attention. Also, I think a number of journalists are uncomfortable talking about the trafficking of boys, but it's a reality. As I mentioned, the racialization of human trafficking is a huge issue. And another large issue currently, and I think we should all be disturbed by this, is the undercoverage of Yazidi women leading up to and after the fall of Mosul and Raqqa. It's extraordinary that we're seeing a number of stories about Raqqa and Mosul right now, but the story which was prominent in 2014 with the taking of Yazidi women in Iraq has basically fallen off the radar with few exceptions. An extraordinary exception, I'm going to give credit to this reporter, was a piece in the New Yorker called Life After ISIS Slavery for Yazidi Women and Children on August 31st, 2017. If you haven't seen it, please look for that article. Another undercovered issue, of course, is what had been covered extensively, but then again fell off the radar, and that is the abduction of Nigerian girls. You remember the campaign, Bring Back Our Girls, but the notion of limiting that to a hashtag and then with little follow-up is absolutely problematic. Many of these girls, not all, have been quote-unquote rescued, but the conditions that they face currently, the conditions that they face in their home villages, the necessary elaboration that's needed to talk about their lives at this point has been absent from our coverage, I'm afraid. Another issue I'd like to talk about in this remaining time I have is the politics of human trafficking. It's been alluded to here importantly, but one of the most glaring media coverage challenges is the coverage of immigration and human trafficking, especially in this age of Trumpian politics, because what you're seeing are hardline anti-immigrant sentiments that are leading to exaggerated and questionable conclusions about human trafficking. There have been, let's talk about the facts. The facts are that, okay, I love that bell. The facts are that trafficking by MS-13, for example, on 18th Street gang, that's absolutely real. That they have been engaged heavily in human trafficking and have been targeting unaccompanied minors. But what we also see is a conflation, for example, in talking about human trafficking and talking about addressing this issue of immigration. I'm not going to play my sound at the moment because during our presentation, when we come back, I'm going to play an example of this where we hear a sheriff talking about correctly about human trafficking and the relationship to MS-13 and the 18th Street gang, transnational groups out of Central America, but conflating his anti-immigrant views with this fight, if you will, against human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Beth, we'll conclude with you.
Okay, I'm going to follow Philip's lead here and just stay right here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Keeley. My role, I am currently the chief of the Human Trafficking Division at the Office of the Attorney General here in Massachusetts. So what I do is I am a prosecutor. I investigate and bring cases, criminal cases of sex trafficking, and working on some labor trafficking cases as well. So I think what I bring to the table is sort of the frontline view in terms of what actually is happening here in this state. And what we actually see when we're investigating sex trafficking cases and looking at labor here and trying to bring those cases as well. And so in terms of the media and public opinion about human trafficking, it's complex, right? I think people, to a certain degree, have an understanding that there's a global issue of human trafficking. And globally, people can sort of wrap their heads around, to a certain degree, again, people being brought over from other countries, forced, by way of a refugee situation or other constraints across the world. And I think for the most part here, people are thinking about seeing people in chains, stashed in a corner. And that's not what it looks like in our state. When we bring a sex trafficking case, we're talking about oftentimes chains that are invisible. They are chains of addiction, chains of cycles of poverty, chains of just psychological harms that have been repeatedly inflicted. And so I was thinking as Philip was talking in terms of sensationalism, I am appreciative of Philip's work because he has worked to, and I've spoken with Philip on work that we've done in our office, and his work as a reporter to sort of, to work against that sensationalism, because I'll let you know how it plays out for me. When I bring a case into court, and I have to pick a jury, and a jury has all they've ever seen in the media, and all they know through what they see on TV or read in the news is people in chains. That's what sex trafficking looks like. Then when I'm trying to convince them that we need to convict this person of sex trafficking, I'm fighting more than one battle in that situation. So from our perspective at the AG's office, when we bring investigations, when we get to the point of prosecuting an individual, we are happy to talk with the media. We want to spread the word about what it really looks like here. And in fact, as an example of something that happened just this year, we were investigating a case of sex trafficking in Boston, in greater Boston, actually it was across the state. And when this trafficker was arrested, it actually garnered quite a bit of media attention. There were news outlets at the arraignment of this individual, and of course, everyone wanted to hear the details of what this investigation sounded like, and it was horrifying, right? Because you're hearing about this trafficker, and he has 6 to 7 women. They're all under the age of 25, and he's sex trafficking them across the state. But what was helpful in this instance was that we were actually, through this arrest and indictment, and then the exposure through the arraignment process, the media being there, follow up with highlighting the issue that we're currently seeing here, the nexus between the opioid epidemic and sex trafficking here in Massachusetts, because all of the women in this particular case were addicted to heroin, and those were the chains in this case. That's how this trafficker was keeping these women constantly drugged up. He was taking all of the, he was telling them what to do, and had them on a willing basis going out, selling sex every night, giving him their money, and he was feeding them heroin. And so the arraignment sort of spotlighted that, and post that coverage of the arraignment, the Boston Herald actually did a 4-part series highlighting various aspects of sex trafficking, of the relatively new sex trafficking law here in Massachusetts, and particularly focused on this issue around opioids and human trafficking. They convened a roundtable discussion where across disciplines, people sat at the table together to talk about this issue, and that was fantastic. And that shows the power, right, of the media to help bring to reflect properly on what we are truly seeing. And so, so to the extent I can bring the what it really looks like here and can contribute to the panel in that way, I'm glad to be here. Thanks very much.
Thank you guys so much for those very interesting discussions and topics. And we're going to do things a little differently this morning. So I have a couple of questions, but this is such an important topic, and I feel like the audience may have a lot of questions as well. So I'm going to try and limit my role in this and let you guys all kind of interact together. But what I kind of wanted to start our discussion off with is, you guys all talked about different terms that are used in the media. So we looked at the difference between the terms of smugglers and traffickers, or how the media talks about something one day, but then maybe the next day it's not as prominent as the case with Nigeria. So how have you guys seen those cases of the media using certain words or only highlighting things for a few days influencing public opinion? And how does that relate to our idea or to a community's idea of what human trafficking is? Anybody?
Well,
Anyone?
I'll start off. I think that on a local level, for example, I think you've seen over the years, I'm going to see if I can make this as concise as possible. Over the years, you've seen an evolution in the use of the term pimp, for example. For a long time, the term pimp did not evoke horror in many communities. It basically, it invited curiosity. They were not vilified to the degree that they should be. Pimp basically was seen as because of popular TV, it was seen almost as a comical character. If you go back to programs from the 70s and 80s, too far for some of you, but the 70s, 80s, even the 90s, and you saw pimps sort of being glorified. It's hard for a pimp when you're trying to make a living. What's that song? Hustle and Flow, the movie Hustle and Flow. It sort of glorified pimps. And now I think that with a focus on human trafficking, people have started to realize this is not an innocuous role. It's not a neutral character in our lives, and it's not the soft side of crime. That's how it was often seen. I think you see another evolution, and one that is really important, but we're not quite there yet. There seems to be, as you pointed out correctly, an incredible conflation between smuggling, human trafficking, where coyotes, those largely smugglers coming in from south of the border and working on the border, and snakeheads, the term used in Asia, for example, to describe smugglers, have totally been conflated with human traffickers. You see it in the Mediterranean, where in Italy, people who are smuggling folks in from Libya have been described as human traffickers. I think education is needed, to be honest with you, for journalists, to basically get the terms right and to be more precise in our language.
Yeah. Are these all on automatically?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things is that we don't actually know that much about public opinion on human trafficking, or at least not among scholars. That you may differ, but and what we know is effectively that what people think about human trafficking is almost entirely determined by what they think about migration. Right? And experiences they've had with migration. And so there too, there is this overlap. And part of what my research is about is sort of, well, how come, right? And I think I tried to show that that's one big reason. But so that's an issue, right? People don't really have a strong independent view of human trafficking per se. It's all blended in with what they think about migration.
Thank you. Anything you would
I mean,
like
I would
to
just,
add?
I would add that that's absolutely right. I know that even in the past year in talking with journalists who've come to our office to sort of get, and they're eager and they're interested in the topic, which is wonderful, but the first, conversation, we generally have more than one conversation with journalists because the first conversation is really just educating them on what trafficking looks like here in this state. So, yeah.
That's great, thank you. To kind of talk to you about your, what you just said about that we don't know much about public opinion, what ways would you recommend to get to know about public opinion? Or what have you seen being done to get to know what is the public's opinion about human trafficking?
Yeah, well, what you need is someone, there are a number of large-scale public opinion surveys. You need them to become interested in this and to find money to ask people about it. That's basically but I think you're initially just going to find that everyone's just going to give you back what they already think about migration. So in some sense, I think it's more important, as you were saying also, that like we should start with education, right? And then we can see maybe if public opinion shifts down the line.
Thank you. I would like to open it up to the audience because I see some hands. So if you, okay, so we'll start right there in the back, and then we'll go over to you, and then we'll go down here to Noura.
Introduce yourself.
Hello, good morning to all. My name is Yasmin. I'm a student here at BU studying international relations and political science. And my question goes more specifically to Maurits. And it is related to the question that Samantha was asking as well. From my understanding, the media's negative framing of migration and trafficking shapes the public desire for border securitization from the states, and it provides an environment where the public prefers border security rather than any welcoming environment for forced migrants. Do you think that the state's decision to keep borders from these criminals is a result of such negative framing that we see in the media?
Well, I wouldn't say a result, but it is probably affected by it, right? There are lots of other things going on. It's not like the media by itself is making all of this happen. But the securitization sort of borders does play a big role, and you probably saw I zipped by it in my tables, but in a number of the newspapers, borders comes up really quite prominently anytime you talk about these issues, right? So sort of the public view of a border sort of keeping us safe from the hordes outside does play a role in sort of what the public wants to do about these various issues.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ninette, and I'm from Brandeis University. Sustainable International Development is my master's degree. My question is, as Phil mentioned it, here in the East Coast, I've been in the US for 5 years, and I'm located in Maine, and I have noticed the human trafficking that it's going on just in that state. And my question here is, we just heard about education, educating people. So how can, because the kids that I have talked to that went through this were actually under 18. So I'm here listening to this and I'm thinking, how then can we bring that education from the, I don't know, from the households maybe, in the family, that way they can know, because we don't talk about it. Even when I'm approaching some people in the community, they think this is happening outside of US, but not here. And I'm like, how can we open their eyes? You know, thanks.
I mean, it's a great question, and I ask myself the same thing. And I think, part of what we can do is things like this, and, continue having conversations and spreading the word, in an organic way, just in the way that we conduct our lives. But I think in the way that I do my work, bringing cases is a way that we can notify the community that this is an issue and this is something we're focused on. And so I seek to do that, and through our office, we seek to make sure that the community knows this is something that that law enforcement here in the state is focused on, and we've devoted efforts to and resources to this. But there's always more work to be done, and I do agree that this baseline is education and awareness. But I think there's just so many ways to do it. We need to do it in every way that we can. So not just prosecution and bringing cases, but in conjunction with the media, with academia, with just having conversations with people.
I'm just curious, were you working with young people?
Yes, I was volunteering.
I'm sorry?
I was doing...
Volunteering.
Oh, volunteering, I see, okay.
Yes, I worked with this woman. She's trying to fight human trafficking in Maine, and she has been through human trafficking as well. And I will go help her and hear some cases from young women, and then from there they will go to the court. So, but I was volunteering just to help, heal these women, because I've been there. I'm one of the survivors. I know, the problem of human trafficking. So that is what I have been doing.
Well, I think part of this dilemma is people who are survivors of human trafficking may not know how to come forward, right? And to sort of speak up, to lend their voice so that we can step in and make a bigger, make their voice larger by bringing a prosecution or something along those lines. So part of the work that our office does is to reach out through community groups and through partner organizations to try to spread the word, but even that needs to have a ground level effect. People need to know within their own communities that it's safe to talk.
Yes.
They need to feel that way, and that is just something you have to, that you have to go into community organizations, churches, the places people do feel safe to get that word out, and so that's work we need to do.
And I applaud your bravery.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
I grabbed the mic, sorry. If you have questions, keep your hands up because we will bring the mics around. This was fascinating, and as I kept thinking about the connections between yesterday and today's conversation, and we had someone in a similar role to you, Beth, but from Seattle, and he was actually looking at the kind of psychology of the buyers and thinking about dealing with that, and this pipeline of foster care, it made me really, and the opioid epidemic really made me think, like, what we're talking about here is in the same way that there are social determinants of health outcomes, there are social determinants of trafficking outcomes. And I wonder if there's a way of actually mapping those very intense nodes, right? Because the foster care pipeline, that's a specific pipeline. It's not that everything matters, it's that there are specific pipelines, and I wonder, in thinking in those terms, whether we can think of specific kinds of choke points as interventions. I don't know if that's something that is just like an academic trying to come up with an idea of like thinking of a synoptic vision, but do you see that there are certain areas that we could target specifically and make an impact? Or does it seem like this is just impacting every industry, every country, and it's hard to know where those pipelines exist?
Well, there are a lot of pipelines, and your question is spot on. Here at Boston University, for example, Julie, who's right in the audience, has been involved in looking at specific ways, as has Ziba Kremer, looking at some of these pipelines. I mean, they're out there. And the question is, which ones do we focus on in order to educate and to elucidate this issue in ways that are not sensationalist? I mean, one of the more interesting nexus, which again has been talked about here, and I'm finding it fascinating as I'm currently working on a separate series about MS-13 and the 18th Street, and I've been fascinated by the very real public safety that exists with transnational gangs, basically are in fact taking advantage of unaccompanied minors. But what I also look at is the exaggerated and hyperbole associated with that issue in the interest of hardline anti-immigrant voices in the country. In fact, if you would permit me, I'd like to just play just a snippet of Sheriff Thomas Hodgson, who I interviewed recently. He's a pretty well-known sheriff here in Massachusetts, who is proud of his hardline stance. He created an immigration ward at Bristol County Jail 2 decades ago, in order to accommodate, if you will, undocumented immigrants. And he's one of the leaders now of this effort to restrict immigration. But here's him talking about this nexus. Hopefully you could hear this.
Well, I see a brand new slave trade that's
Can you hear that? Oh, hold on.
I often laugh to myself when I hear people calling, anti-immigrant.
Oh, yeah, let's play it here then. Okay. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, thanks. I thought Sher would play fine there.
Sure. Here, go to Julie.
Okay. So thank you. This is really quite interesting. So this is a question about your research. So later in the day, I'm going to talk a little bit about the expansion of the trafficking concept, both in terms of rhetoric, which I don't have to speak about now because you already spoke about it, and also in terms of the law and how it's been used or has a potential to be used in different ways. One is protection, potentially, as the definition expands, it can protect more people. But also what you're speaking about is enforcement and negative enforcement, especially in the context of immigration. So I'm just interested in terms of the media and tracking the media. Have you been able to break out of those articles, which are more focused on immigration enforcement that maybe has negative impacts on survivors, and what focuses maybe on protection? And my second question is, what is the solution to this? So if it's problematic, this conflation, is the solution to focus more efforts on protection, like this broader definition, or is it to focus on a more limited, educating about a more limited definition, an appropriate definition?
Yeah, so this is, as I sort of said at the very beginning, it's a larger project I'm working on with my students, and so that sort of breaking out and homing in on particular things, we haven't gotten there yet. So what I presented was the overall picture, right? And now I lost my train of thought. What was the second question?
Second question is, what is the answer? Is it about refocusing those journalistic efforts, or
Yeah, so, well, one solution, or not solution, but one thing that will help is, the quotation I showed at the start, that's the UNHCR's top person, right? And he's essentially just saying, trafficking, refugee migration, it's all the same thing. That does not help the public get a clearer vision of how they differ. And so even just more, just careful use of the concept by politicians, by journalists, and so on, so that, if you're Joe Q public reading, just sort of reading newspapers over time, if the concepts are always used consistently and sort of correctly, that in and of itself, I think, would help a lot.
Great.
Yeah.
We can go over to Phillip, yeah.
Let's see if this actually works, I'm not sure.
Well, I see.
Yeah, it came through. Right?
Can you hear that?
Slave trade.
Let's see.
There's probably a volume on that little module.
Yeah, there should be.
Well, let's see. Someone probably knows this better than I do.
This might have
Volume up?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's try this. Okay. Anyway, this is again, the sheriff is not completely wrong, but there's just a level of hyperbole here that you'll hear it.
If you'll hear it.
Well, I see a brand new slave trade that's developed and is existing throughout this country. I often laugh to myself when I hear people going, you're anti-immigrant, and that somehow we should support people being able to come here and exploited the way that they are. Sex trafficking and human trafficking are out of control in the United States of America right now. And they are in large part because so many of these people who are coming here illegally are trying to make their way, and they're being exploited by people who are using them and pulling them into these sex and human trafficking trades. You got young girls whose mothers are giving them birth control pills before they hand them off to a coyote for the 1,000-mile trek to the U.S. border, either in El Salvador, Guatemala, or wherever, because they know their daughters are going to get raped at least once before they get here. That child gets here, pushed off some family in New Bedford or somewhere else from the border, in foster care, with no family support to deal with her problem, is put into a school where she doesn't speak the language, never lived in the culture, still dealing with her trauma, of course, and guess who's the target of all the bullies in the classroom who doesn't speak English? She is. So now on top of what she's already not been able to deal with and process, she now has the other issues of being bullied. And then she goes home to her foster care home and steps out onto the street after school and on the weekend, and guess who the weakest link in the neighborhood is? She is. And here we go again. I spoke to an immigration.
What's the evidence of the link that you're talking about?
Well, the facts that I just gave you about the Washington Post report is documented.
But I mean, here in Massachusetts.
Well, here in Massachusetts, in every community, this is going on. We know what's going on. Even the immigration attorney I spoke to, when I were talking about this guy has been dealing with immigration. He's probably one of the top immigration lawyers, legitimate immigration lawyers, and he sees it every day.
So anyway, the point here is that the sheriff is absolutely correct in talking about the fact that young people are being exploited who are crossing the border. The problem, and I haven't, by the way, this is part of a story that's coming up. We haven't even aired this yet. But part of the problem here is that there's a degree of hyperbole and basically drawing conclusions by anecdote, by pointing to something he heard, and basically using that in conjunction with a Washington Post article. There was indeed a Washington Post article, a very good piece, talking about how unaccompanied minors, there were a flow of unaccompanied minors, as you may remember, from 2013 up until the current point, but a surge in 2016, and over 100,000 in 2016. Many of these young people, in fact, were taken advantage of. But what happens is this has become a talking point within the community of those who are militating hard against immigration, both legal but largely undocumented immigration to this country. Another point of conflation, and I'll just make this the last point, is that you find also this issue being talked about among those who militate against Planned Parenthood as an organization. Planned Parenthood has become sort of the bête noire of many, and they cite something that's totally not true. It's complete falsehood that Planned Parenthood facilitates human trafficking. No matter what your position is on abortion, that's just an outright falsehood. So those are the things that we as journalists have to be careful of when we're interviewing people, that these things aren't promulgated as fact, and that we push back against what people call evidence.
Oh, thank you.
I was standing over here to take a question, but because I have the microphone, I'm going to ask one more, or actually just pose it briefly, and then go back to the audience. And that is that that clip so illustrated the danger of anecdote, because he's absolutely right, and this is the thing about this journalism and public opinion panel that shows that there is a relationship, a symbiotic relationship between the collection of stories and the illustration of untold stories, but then one has to be careful not to let those stories and those anecdotes replace empirical, large-scale analysis, because I would love to put that sheriff in a room with the prosecutor from last night, Val, who was basically showing the disproportionate relationship between the demand and supply, that it doesn't matter if you remove the supply of these girls. The demand will just focus with higher pressure on those who are left. And so I just wanted to pose that as such an interesting thing about this panel. I didn't know if anyone wanted to respond to that, about the role of journalism between collecting stories, but also managing large data.
It's a great question because journalism, of course, is about stories, but increasingly journalism is also about data. And really good journalism, of course, will combine both data and those stories. And the hope, of course, and the purpose is to basically create a real picture, not verisimilitude, but a real picture of what is happening out in these communities. We're currently working, when I say we, WGBH with the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. We're working on a series right now with Ziba and her crew here at Boston University to try to collect data, and Beth, by the way, to try to collect data looking at, I don't want to say too much about it because my competitors from WBUR might be in the room. I'm just kidding. But the idea is that we're looking at rub maps and the role massage parlors play in this state and around the country. And the important thing, again, is not to engage in issues that, in a way that is sensationalist, but to be very precise about language and to be precise about data. I'm not a data person, but there are others who are, and I'm happy to work with them in order to collect the correct data and to basically create a picture that's based on both those voices, to humanize those people who are victimized by human trafficking, and to basically show the magnitude of that problem through data. And other journals are seeking to do that, by the way. I've seen more and more over the years. I was at a workshop last year on investigative reporting, and more journalists, those who in fact admit they engaged in sensationalist reporting on this issue in the past, are now looking at ways to create more constructive models of reporting, similar to what we've seen with The Guardian. I think The Guardian has done a really good job in reporting on human trafficking.
I think you're completely right, and the importance of pushing back against the anecdote being held up as representative, right, is you can only really do that if the data is available. And that's where I think academics and maybe lawyers and so can play an important role in making the data available to journalists, right? Because it's the journalists who are sort of, that's what you see on the news, is someone interviewing whoever, a random politician, let's say, who's going to come up with some anecdote and hold it up as though it is representative. And if the journalists have the data that allow them to say, wait, this is an anecdote and it's true, but it's one data point, and if you look at the pattern, that is not representative.
Absolutely.
From my perspective, I'm not like practitioner, I'm not journalist, I'm just a student, but I while researching on this topic, and I felt like in the world there are a lot of data that collected by journalists or collected by NGOs or collected by like international organizations, but these data are not like consolidated and they are not analyzed enough to make it into information, not like just the raw data there. So that's how I come up with this cloud platform so that they can put their data, and also journalists can collect their data by interviewing and investigating, but also they can make a partnership with NGOs, or like I founded the Polaris project. They also running the hotline, 24 hotline. So that means that they already have their own data. And also the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, they also have their data, and they are launching open source data so that all the publics can access. So I think the role of journalism here is not only collecting data, but also they consolidate and put all those data together so they can picture it in a very visual way. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Question back here, too. Good morning. My name is Panita Jansa. I'm the directing attorney at the Thai Community Development Center in Los Angeles. And thank you so much for your presentations. I just wanted to kind of note that, you know, as a practitioner from a community-based organization, we do work in task forces and try to raise public awareness. So we will hold press conferences and try to speak with the press. And there's a two-part question. We do try to partner with journalists and the media, but most of the time, what they want is to speak with our victims. And I'm ethically obligated to my clients, my clients who have been victims and became survivors. I can't even ask them for an interview because they'll feel obligated to say yes. And that affects the level of coverage by our media because they want something that's newsworthy and maybe more sensational and whatnot. And the second part of my question goes to the data. So in terms of the data, we work with so many partners. So we're one small community organization, but we have other partners in the community that serve this client population that have been victims of human trafficking in both sex and labor. But what we do is really count the clients that we serve so that we can see trends in how many clients are coming in to see us, and they're coming in to see us because we're a trusted community-based organization. And how do we make that more presentable? So I want to know, as a practitioner, how we can make that partnership better and how to make that data more out there.
That's a great question, and I'll tell you why. When you work with a lot of community organizations, and I've had this experience, the job of those community organizations and those advocacy organizations are to basically protect those survivors, those victims. I prefer the term survivors. And the conundrum for journalists is that in order for us to humanize these stories, in order for us to actually get people to basically even believe some of this information, data is one thing. Data can be cold, hard, and impersonal. You really need the voices of those survivors. And journalists run up against this all the time, where it's hard sometimes to find someone, organizations to say, yeah, we'd like to introduce you to those survivors. And the reason, those organizations have been burnt in the past, where the names have been exposed, where the information has been exposed that should not have been exposed. I think you have to come to some agreement, working perhaps over time, or the limited time a journalist might have between deadline and publication or airing, to basically gain their trust. The onus is on journalists actually to gain the trust of you and those you work with. But it's very important, it's essential, in fact, that we speak with survivors and that we have their voices in the piece, whether it's in print or radio or television. And using devices such as obscuring the voice or obscuring the face, obscuring information is necessary and helpful. But I think it's really important that those of you who work with survivors, that you know that it is absolutely necessary that in order for a story to basically have impact, the greatest impact, you have to talk to survivors. That's just the bottom line.
Great. Okay, we have one more question.
Hi, morning. I'm Natalie Dietrich Jones. I'm a research fellow at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And my question is to Professor van der Veen. Julie kind of touched on what I wanted to ask in terms of the definition of these terms, because within the discipline of migration, there is inconsistency itself. I do research on undocumented migration, and I had to choose between undocumented, irregular, and illegal. So so the point is that there's inconsistency in the discipline, but there's also this issue that migration is a fluid process. And so can you really have one specific term with this fluidity? So that's one question. And then the other is, would you elaborate on the approach that you use? I think you said it's co-location analysis. If you could describe what that process entails.
Yeah, so the definitional issue is a really big one, as you said, in the literature. And that makes it hard, right? But there are, since the UN, like the whole process for the UN to come up with definitions back in 2000 was also incredibly hard, and people have sort of studied how that happened. But now we have legal definitions of what, at least in trafficking, right, of what trafficking is. The US has a definition and the UN has a definition. They're mostly compatible. And they are different from what smuggling is, right? And so that is one distinction that I think we can make relatively clearly, and that isn't made nearly often enough. But I always, so the way I always look at it is, it's not like there's one true definition out there that is forever unchanging, changing what's handed down and whatever, right? But what is incumbent upon us is to try to be both as consistent as possible and as clear as possible. So like, I only had 5 minutes, so I just kind of ran through it. But in the academic paper, I'm going to sort of take a paragraph and say, this is what the definition is, sort of the legal definition, and this is how these terms are used, and so on and so forth. The other thing to say there is that the definitional issue you point out, right, between undocumented, irregular, and illegal, obviously has political overtones as well, right? And so you could see in the papers I kind of highlighted that the Washington Post and the Guardian kind of shifted towards more like undocumented becomes a prominent term there, but like the Daily Mail continues to call everyone illegal, right? And so there are political aspects there as well. But again, if you're sort of clear about what it is you're doing, then I think you get around a lot of the problematicness happens when you're not clear, when you just sort of say all of this is illegal and don't explain why, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. I would like to thank you guys. This was such an incredible panel with such different perspectives and topics, and thank you all for coming. Before we move into our 15-minute break, I would just encourage everybody to don't stop the conversation here. As you go to the break tomorrow, next week, continue this discussion with your peers, with people you work with or at school, so that this is a continued dialogue. With that, we have some coffee and some light snacks, so please join me in getting a small break.